talk about the challenges of race relations today are Dr. Neil Lester, Foundation Professor of English and Founding Director of Project Humanities at Arizona State University, Carlos Galindo Elvira, Regional Director for the Anti-Defamation League Arizona, Dr. Iracema Coronado, Director for the ASU School of Transborder Studies, and Petra Falcon, Executive Director for Promise Arizona. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Dr. Lester, the message in Chapter 1, Legacy, was that race is always a factor. Do you think that's still the case in what we're seeing today?
Absolutely.
Not just nationally, but in Arizona?
Absolutely. And race and violence, that combination. America was founded on this reality of violence against one group from another group. So the fact that it acknowledges the fact that racism exists and racism manifests itself in these various acts of violence, both covert and overt. And the past is the present, which is why we have to go back to that history of lynching and Jim Crow.
And speaking of violence, Carlos, the president, in response to the Christchurch shootings in New Zealand, was asked about whether white nationalism was a rising threat, and he said no, it's a small group of people. ADL has done its own analyses and I think has come to a different conclusion.
Yes, we have to accept that white nationalism is a global threat. It's not just something happening here in the United States, it's everywhere. And since Charlottesville, we've seen 73 murders perpetuated by white supremacists. In Arizona alone, 63% of hate crimes in 2017 were based on race. So it is a threat. White supremacy is a threat, and it's time for the federal government to take it more seriously and to mobilize all of its efforts, whether it's the Department of Homeland Security all the way to the FBI.
So the big debate in the last couple of weeks has been whether the president has done anything that has encouraged it. And you have the people pointing out that the shooter in El Paso said he had formed these beliefs before the president. But as reflected in the video, there was a statement there that physical aggression seems to be increasing and that since the election, people seem to be freer or feel freer to be who they really are.
I think one of the things that we need to step back and take a look at are social media platforms like 8chan, where you see that violence is glorified and hate is a freewheeling subject matter for white supremacists and extremists. And if you have these social media platforms that are encouraging this type of behavior, it can lead to radicalizing disaffected individuals.
Petra, there was a lot of discussion about identity, and some of it was portrayed in a somewhat sympathetic light for young white males who feel like they've lost, as one of them put it, control of our country, the country we founded. Is there a point there, though, when they say what's wrong with expressing white pride? You know that Mexicans in particular, we talk about la raza, and that's viewed by some as the same kind of thing, but not in a negative way. What's the difference, do you think?
Well, I think, first of all, we all have grown up with this idea that America is great because of its diversity. And so whether you're white or black or brown or yellow, I mean, we're still part of this melting pot. And for us to start thinking that, oh, white supremacy or being la raza is something negative, it really goes against what we've all grown up with as our values. So we have to really talk about who we are and how do we embrace our heritage and our roots and our country. La raza is basically just a group of people, and we forget that we are people, and we're people first. And then you start tacking on identity or la raza or white supremacists or whoever. And, you know, I think we just have to go back to understanding who we are.
But Dr. Lester, does he have a point where he says, you know, we have black pride, we have gay pride, la raza, the race for Latinos. What's wrong with white pride?
Well, there's nothing wrong with that because one can have pride in one's identity group. The problem is that there's systems in place and institutions in place that manifest violence overtly or covertly against other groups. So if, for example, we were to talk about white supremacy within a context of privilege and representation and identity, then those become slightly different issues. And when that's manifested in the ways in which people are hired or fired, or the extent to which they can get good jobs or to live in certain neighborhoods, then to be white in this country means that you are represented, and the people who are making decisions about you are white. Doesn't mean every white person, but it means a system of whiteness where you belong. So when you walk into a place, you see yourself. You know that you're validated because the person in authority from whom you'll have to ask for a bank loan likely looks like you. But I would even say that that has to be more complicated because it's also very gendered. Notice that in the documentary, it's white males of a certain age group, of a certain demographic. So we have to sort of tease back, I think, these layers of privilege and bias that run rampant under this umbrella we call white supremacy.
Dr. Coronado, your areas of study really do lend themselves to discussion of these issues, the border, immigration, but at a more personal level, you've spent the last 20 years or so in El Paso. You just came to Arizona, I think, a couple of months ago. That chapter 4 was about fear. What's the other side of that? They were talking about fear of people like the Identity Europa folks. In El Paso, I assume you've been talking to friends and relatives there. What's going on there? What's the mood?
A lot of fear, a lot of sadness, a lot of despair, a lot of devastation. And, you know, I just spoke with a friend today. He has 2 sons, 15 and 17. They were on their way to the Cielo Vista Mall, which is in close proximity to where these tragic events occurred. They to buy school supplies and buy school clothes. And on their way, they were listening to the radio and heard the tragedy. And he said his sons have not been the same ever since. And they're afraid to go out. They have not gone school shopping. He's like, how do we process this? And that they feel targeted because they're Mexican. And so how do you deal with that? I think one of the biggest problems that we have in this society is inequality. And there's an academic by the name of Richard Wilkinson who argues that inequality promotes social isolation. And that social isolation means that we don't know each other, we don't reach out to our friends and our neighbors and other communities. And that isolation leads to not having trust in other individuals. And also, Wilkinson argues that income inequality exacerbates and intensifies the dominance and the subordination and the feelings of superiority and inferiority. And so some groups feel better because economically they have more and those that have less. But I think fear is rampant in this society. And some of the research I've done on the border, families of mixed, varying degrees of legalities and mixed status are afraid of deportation. And we saw that yesterday with the raids in the South. People feel, you know, what's going to happen to my children if I'm deported? And fear is driving people's emotions, and it's not a good way to live.
Petra, what about the fear, though, that white nationalists, if we want to categorize them that way, express themselves? They're afraid, and you even have the one gentleman talking about preparing for a race war.
That's a great question. I think fear, where does fear come from? That's the question, is where does fear come from? And it comes from the potential of losing something. And so what is it that people are afraid to lose? Obviously a lot, their privilege, or what they have, or somebody's going to come and take something away. That was the whole premise behind SB 1070 in this state, was immigrants are coming across the border and they're going to take our jobs, they're going to take this and they're going to take that, and they're taking benefits from people that really should be having those benefits. So it's a fear of what we're going to lose.
And perhaps closer to home, just last week we had comments by Representative Sylvia Allen expressing in some respects that same kind of fear about the demographics changing, and echoing somewhat what Representative David Stringer said months ago.
Yeah, the browning of Arizona. And the reality is that it is happening. But, you know, and so what? You know, so what if there's going to be lots more black and brown people in our community, and what are we going to do about that? We've got to deal with that.
And minoritized communities have always lived in fear. That's what's interesting about this conversation. It's as though fear just happened now and racism and hatred just happened now. But if we know our history, which is where this documentary starts, then we know there are, missing and murdered indigenous women and indigenous communities who were killed under this name of genocide when this country was founded. So this notion that one person posits in there that we founded this is irrational and wrong. So this notion of fear of whole communities being burned down and churches being bombed and people who are just, as they talked about, agitating to have human rights and education has been our American history. So this notion of fear and violence and race is not new. What's new is the fact that we have access to it so quickly and in so many different places. But that's what I think we have to grapple with, is this notion that this is not new, that if we knew our history, we would know that violence has always been part of our identities.
Jose, I wanted to jump back just a little bit when you asked the question about identity. One of the things that struck me in the video was the portrayal of some of the hate groups as wholesome and American flag holding. And
the Identity Europa spokesperson sounded very rational and
let's not mistake,
talking about things we could all agree on.
Let's not mistake, this new branding is the same old hate. It is just repackaged in khakis and polo shirts. We cannot be fooled that this behavior is for the good of our country. These are the type of groups that banner across bridges in Tucson, Arizona with anti-immigrant messaging, or flyer ASU with anti-Jewish messaging. So it's not wholesome. It's the same old hate, just repackaged to make it more acceptable.
And Dr. Coronado, this fear of the browning of America, is that something that you've looked at in your studies as well?
Well, it's something that if people understood their history, this used to be indigenous, and then it was part of Spain, and then it was part of Mexico. I mean, Arizona only became a state.
It's coming, and forgive me for cutting you out, but just one last quick question. We're almost out of time, Dr. Lester. The documentary itself, did it capture the full flavor of what we're dealing with, this scope of the hate?
Well, I don't know that any one thing can capture the full flavor. I think it gives us a taste of this, and whenever we can have an opportunity to sort of taste morsels, the question becomes, what does one do after that? And I'd have to say, at the end of the last chapter that talks about reform, I'm a little misled by that because I saw nothing in the documentary that suggested that there was some plan, there was some prescription. The one person met somebody who happened to be in his life.
So you're not as optimistic as that last section portrayed?
I'm not quite as optimistic, but it's not an either or.
Okay, and on that note, thank you all for joining us on this special edition. Appreciate it.
Right.
The latest Carnegie Night News 21 project will be released next week. They investigate disaster recovery across America. To see this investigation and for more in-depth reporting on hate in America, go to news21.com. And that's our show for tonight. We thank you for watching this Arizona Horizon and Horizonte special. I'm Jose Cardenas. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Arizona Horizon is made possible by contributions from the Friends of Arizona PBS, members of your PBS station. Thank you.
Programs on Arizona PBS are funded in part by a gift from the estate of Brigitte Sierre. For more information on how to include Arizona PBS in your estate plans, call 602-496-8888.
Coming up next on Arizona PBS, Life and World. Explore new ideas and new worlds here on Arizona PBS, a community service of Arizona State University. Support for Arizona PBS comes from viewers like you and from
Hospice of the Valley, medical, social, and spiritual care for patients nearing end of life, and support for their families. A not-for-profit community hospice. HOV.org.
Ironwood Cancer and Research Center. Our team of breast surgeons, gynecologic oncologists, and genetic counselors provide personalized care and treatment options for women. Academic cancer care in a community setting, outsmarting cancer one patient at a time.